Part 1. The routine test. It started innocuously, as these things often do. My husband, Alex, and I were at the doctor's office for a routine checkup for our son, Ethan. At 8 years old, Ethan had always been a bundle of energy, a blur of scraped knees, missing teeth, and endless questions. The checkup was part of a school health screening, just a blood test to rule out any hereditary concerns. I sat in the corner of the room, scrolling through my phone as the nurse prepared the equipment. Alex was the one holding Ethan's hand, talking him through the process with his usual calm demeanor. It was a familiar scene, one I had taken for granted over the years. When the results came back, the pediatrician called us into her office. She looked serious, but not alarmed, so I assumed it was just routine advice on nutrition or exercise. Instead, she started with a phrase that made my stomach twist. "This isn't something we normally find, but there's a mismatch in the blood types." "A mismatch?" Alex asked, his brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" The pediatrician explained that based on the blood work, Ethan's blood type didn't align with the genetic possibilities of ours. "It's likely just a clerical error," she assured us. "But I'd recommend a retest to confirm." Alex and I exchanged glances, his filled with confusion, mine carefully neutral. My heart was pounding so loudly, I thought it might drown out the doctor's voice. The second test was scheduled for the following week, but the questions started that night. "You're sure they didn't mess up the initial results?" Alex asked as we climbed into bed. His tone was calm, but I could feel the undercurrent of unease. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "You know how these things go. Medical mix-ups aren't exactly rare." But my mind was racing. This wasn't a mix-up. It couldn't be. And the secrets I'd buried so deeply for the past 9 years began clawing their way back to the surface. Part 2. The secrets we bury. The week leading up to the second test was a slow spiral into dread. Every moment of silence felt like a countdown. Every shared look with Alex a potential landmine. I threw myself into distractions, cleaning, errands, even organizing Ethan's old baby pictures in a dusty scrapbook I hadn't touched in years. Anything to stop my mind from running wild. It wasn't working. The truth was I knew exactly what the second test would reveal. Ethan wasn't Alex's son. That part of the story was no mystery to me. But the how and why of it, the story I'd never told, the one I convinced myself I'd take to the grave, was much messier. 9 years ago, Alex and I were newlyweds. The kind of couple people admired. Young, ambitious, and madly in love. But marriage wasn't the fairy tale I'd imagined. Alex's long hours at the law firm left me feeling more like a roommate than a wife. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that the loneliness was just a phase. I didn't believe in airing my grievances when I could just swallow them whole. Then, there was Mark. Mark was nothing like Alex. Charming but aimless. Always laughing but never serious. He was an old college friend who had shown up in town unexpectedly, looking for a place to crash for a week or two. That week turned into a month, and before I knew it, he was practically part of the household. We had history, Mark and I. Not romantic, not really, but there was always an energy between us, a dangerous flirtation I'd never let myself explore. Until that night. Alex had been working late for the third night in a row, and Mark and I stayed up talking over a bottle of wine. It started innocently enough. Stories about college, shared grievances about the grind of adult life. But somewhere along the way, the lines blurred. I don't know who leaned in first, but I remember the kiss, electric and reckless. And I remember not stopping it. It happened only once, and by the next morning I hated myself. I swore it would never happen again, and Mark left town shortly after. I buried the guilt deep, telling myself it was a stupid, isolated mistake. 2 months later, I found out I was pregnant. I had no reason to doubt Ethan was Alex's child. The timing fit. Mark was already a distant memory, and I'd clung to that belief as fiercely as I clung to Alex's steady love when he teared up at the first ultrasound. Now, that belief was crumbling. My life, the life we'd built, felt like a house of cards waiting for the gentlest breeze to send it tumbling down. Part 3. The results are in. The day of the second test arrived with a grim inevitability. Ethan seemed more curious than worried, peppering us with questions about why he needed another test. "Are they going to poke me again?" he asked, wrinkling his nose. "Just one more time, bud," Alex said, ruffling Ethan's hair. His voice was steady, but I noticed how he avoided looking directly at me. That quiet confidence of his, so dependable, so unshakable, seemed a little thinner today. At the clinic, the test was quick and clinical, as if the technician had no idea she was holding the future of my family in her hands. I sat stiffly in the waiting area, flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading, while Alex sat across from me, bouncing his knee in an uncharacteristic display of nerves. Ethan, blissfully unaware, was playing a game on his tablet. "They said results should only take a day or two," Alex said quietly, breaking the silence. "That's good," I replied, forcing a smile I hoped looked convincing. "The sooner we clear this up, the better." Alex nodded, but I could see the doubt flickering behind his eyes. He didn't press further, though, and for that, I was both relieved and terrified. The results came the next evening. Alex and I sat at the kitchen table after Ethan had gone to bed, staring at his unopened email on Alex's laptop. The subject line read, "Follow-up results, Ethan Morgan." The weight of it pressed down on me like a stone. "You want to open it?" Alex asked, his fingers hovering over the mouse. I hesitated. "Maybe it's better if you do." He clicked, and as his eyes scanned the screen, I watched his face change. The confusion from last week was back, but this time it was darker, edged with disbelief and anger. "I don't understand," he said, his voice hollow. "It says Ethan isn't biologically my son. That can't be right." I swallowed hard. My throat felt like it was closing up. "Alex," I began, my voice trembling. "Maybe." "Maybe what?" he snapped, his head whipping up to look at me. "This has to be some kind of mistake. You and there's no way." I couldn't hold his gaze. "There's an explanation," I said, my words barely above a whisper. For a moment, he just stared at me, the weight of my words sinking in. Then his voice dropped, dangerously calm. "What kind of explanation?" My stomach churned as I realized there was no easy way to say it. The truth wasn't a scalpel, it was a wrecking ball. "Alex, there's a chance Ethan isn't yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Alex's face contorted in a mixture of shock and betrayal, and when he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "You cheated on me?" "I nodded, till spilling over." "It was one time, before we knew I was pregnant. I thought he was yours. I convinced myself." He pushed back from the table abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the tile. "You thought," he said, his voice rising. "You convinced yourself? You've let me believe Ethan was mine for 8 years, and now this." I reached for him, but he flinched away like my touch burned. "Alex, I didn't know for sure. I was scared. I thought if I never said anything, it wouldn't matter." "Well, it does matter," he said, his voice shaking. "It matters to me. It matters to Ethan. God, what am I even supposed to tell him?" My heart shattered at the thought of Ethan, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. "Please," I begged, "don't tell him yet. Let's figure this out first." Alex stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, without another word, he grabbed his keys and left, the sound of the door slamming echoing through the house. I sat there alone, the reality of what I'd done sinking in. The life I'd built was unraveling, and I had no idea how to stop it. Part 4, Fallout. Alex didn't come home that night. I called his phone a dozen times, each attempt sending me straight to voicemail. By midnight, I'd resorted to pacing the living room, every creak of the floorboards echoing my guilt. Ethan woke up once, wandering out of his room, rubbing his eyes. "Where's Dad?" he asked, his voice small. "Just running errands, sweetie," I lied, guiding him back to bed. "Go back to sleep." By morning, Alex still hadn't returned, and his absence felt like a gaping wound in the house. When he finally walked in, the tension between us was suffocating. He didn't say a word at first, just set his keys on the counter and stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Anger, disappointment, and something else. Resignation, maybe. "We need to talk," he said finally. I nodded, though my heart was hammering in my chest. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had unraveled the night before. His voice was measured, but each word cut deep. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his tone heavy with pain. "You had years to say something, to give me a choice." "I was scared," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Scared of losing you, of destroying what we had. I told myself it didn't matter, that it wasn't worth ruining our family over something I couldn't change." "You couldn't change it, but you could have been honest," he shot back. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out the son you've loved, raised, and sacrificed for might not even be yours?" Tears streamed down my face, but I knew I had no right to ask for forgiveness. "I never doubted that you were his dad in every way that mattered," I said. "And I swear, Alex, this doesn't change how much you mean to him, or to me." Alex's laugh was bitter. "It doesn't change it? Are you serious? Everything has changed. How can I even look at him without wondering?" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I love that boy. He's my world. But now—" He didn't finish, and the silence between us was unbearable. Finally, he sighed, his voice softer, but no less anguished. "We need to find out the truth. A DNA test. No more guesses. No more half-truths. We owe him that." I nodded, knowing there was no room to argue. "Okay," I said, my voice barely audible. "And until we know for sure," he added, "I need space. I'll stay with my brother for a while." My heart sank. "Alex, please don't." "I have to," he interrupted, his tone firm. "I can't be here right now. Not like this." When he walked out the door, the sound of it closing felt final, like the end of something I'd taken for granted for far too long. Ethan came into the kitchen not long after, his messy hair and sleepy eyes a painful reminder of the innocents caught in the crossfire. "Is Dad going on a trip?" he asked. I forced a smile, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Just for a little while, honey," I said. "He'll be back soon." But as I hugged my son tightly, I couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at me. What if this test, this truth we were hurtling toward, shattered everything beyond repair? Part 5. The DNA test. The kit arrived a few days later in a nondescript box, as if it didn't carry the weight of our entire lives inside. Alex returned briefly to oversee the process, his demeanor distant but composed. Ethan sat at the kitchen table between us, swinging his legs absent-mindedly. "This is so weird," he said, wrinkling his nose as Alex swabbed his cheek. "Why do you need my spit?" "It's for science, buddy," Alex replied, managing a faint smile. "Just making sure we've got all the info we need to keep you healthy." I sat there silently, my hands gripping the edge of my chair, wishing I could melt into the floor. Ethan's innocence in all of this made the weight of my choices almost unbearable. When Alex finished sealing the sample, he placed the box carefully in the outgoing mail pile. His movements were deliberate, each action loaded with unspoken emotion. "You'll hear from the lab in a couple of weeks," he said flatly, not meeting my eyes. "Alex," I began, reaching out instinctively, but he stepped back, his expression a mix of exhaustion and guarded anger. "Not now," he said. "I can't do this right now." And just like that, he was gone again, leaving a silence behind that seemed to stretch on forever. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day felt like a lifetime, filled with imaginary worst-case scenarios that played on a loop in my head. I tried to act normal for Ethan's sake, packing his lunches, helping him with homework, cheering him on at soccer games. But every time I looked at him, I couldn't stop wondering what would happen if the truth came out. Would Alex stay? Would he leave us both? And what about Ethan? How could I possibly explain this to him without breaking his heart? The email finally came 2 weeks later, a notification that made my stomach drop the second I saw it. I stared at the screen for a long time before I could bring myself to open it. The results were clear. Alex wasn't Ethan's biological father. The confirmation I'd dreaded for years was now in black and white, undeniable and irreversible. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity before calling Alex. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipped and distant. "Did you get the results?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. And I swallowed hard. It's what we thought." There was silence on the other end, long enough for me to wonder if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but laced with pain. Okay, he said. I'll come by later. Before I could respond, he ended the call, leaving me to face the crushing weight of what came next. When Alex arrived that evening, the air between us was thick with tension. He sat down at the same kitchen table where we'd shared countless family meals, but this time, the space between us felt like a canyon. I'm staying, he said abruptly, catching me off guard. You are? I whispered, a mixture of hope and disbelief swelling in my chest. For Ethan, he clarified, his tone steady but cold. He's my son, no matter what that paper says. But you and me? That's a different story. My heart sank. Alex, don't, he interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't apologize again. Don't explain. I've heard it all before. I nodded, tears brimming in my eyes. I just want to make this right. You can't, he said simply, his gaze piercing. Not entirely, but I'll do what I can for Ethan. He deserves stability, and I'm not going to let your mistakes take that away from him. His words stung, but I knew they were fair. This was the fallout I had caused, and now I had to live with it. But as Alex left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall, I couldn't help but wonder if staying for Ethan would ever be enough to rebuild the life we'd lost. Part 6, The Shift. The days that followed Alex's declaration were awkward, a strained dance of forced civility. He moved back into the house, but the warmth between us was gone, replaced by a polite distance that hurt more than outright anger. For Ethan's sake, Alex was every bit the devoted father he had always been. They played video games together, worked on Ethan's science project, and even built a birdhouse in the backyard one Saturday afternoon. Watching them made my chest ache with a bittersweet mixture of relief and regret. But with me, Alex was different, guarded, his words clipped and devoid of emotion. He answered my questions with the bare minimum and avoided being in the same room as me unless Ethan was around. I couldn't blame him. One night, after Ethan was in bed, I tried to bridge the gap. I found Alex in the living room, scrolling through his phone. Can we talk? I asked hesitantly. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable, and after a moment he nodded. I sat down on the edge of the couch, leaving a wide space between us. I know I can't undo what I've done, I began, my voice trembling. But I want to try to fix this, Alex. For us. For Ethan. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know if it can be fixed, Claire, he said. Every time I look at you, I think about the years you let me believe a lie. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Tears pricked my eyes. I hate myself for what I've done to you. To us, I was selfish and scared, and I thought I was protecting everyone. But I see now how much damage I've caused. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, if you'll let me. Alex stared at me for a long moment, his face a mixture of exhaustion and pain. It's not just about trust, he said finally. It's about everything I thought we had. How do I know what was real? How do I know if I even want to try again? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stood and walked toward the hallway. I need time, Claire, he said over his shoulder. Don't push me. The next few weeks passed in a blur of careful routines and cautious conversations. I focused on being present for Ethan, helping with homework, making his favorite meals, and tucking him in with extra-long hugs. But no matter how hard I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, the cracks in our family were impossible to ignore. And then, out of nowhere, the first twist. One evening, as I was clearing the dinner table, Alex's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening, and quickly picked it up, stepping into the other room. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed him doing this lately. Calls he didn't take in front of me. Texts he kept hidden. I told myself it was nothing, probably work or his brother checking in. But something about his body language nagged at me. Later that night, after Alex had gone to bed, I caught a glimpse of his phone left unattended on the coffee table. The screen lit up briefly with a message. Thinking of you. Can't wait to see you again. My heart sank. I picked up the phone, my hands shaking. The message was from someone named Lauren. I never heard of her. I stood there, frozen, staring at the screen as a sick realization began to dawn. Had Alex already started looking elsewhere? And if he had, could I even blame him? Part 7. The Other Woman. I didn't sleep that night. The message from Lauren burned in my mind like a brand. and I couldn't stop replaying it over and over. Who was she? How long had this been going on? By the time morning came, I was exhausted but determined to confront Alex. I waited until Ethan left for school, the house quiet except for the faint sound of Alex rummaging in the kitchen. I saw a text on your phone last night, I said, my voice shaking. He froze, a coffee mug halfway to his lips, then slowly set it down. You went through my phone? It was right there, Alex, I shot back. And I didn't go through it. I saw the screen light up. Someone named Lauren sent you a message. Alex rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my gaze. It's not what you think, he said, his tone defensive. Then tell me what it is, I demanded, my voice rising. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he sighed heavily and leaned against the counter. Lauren is someone I've been talking to, he admitted. I met her at the gym a few weeks ago. We've gone out for coffee a couple of times. The words hit me like a physical blow. You gone out for coffee? While we're still married. You don't get to be indignant, he snapped, his voice hardening. You lied to me for years, Claire. You destroyed our marriage. And now you're mad because I found someone who actually listens to me. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced myself to stand my ground. I know I've hurt you, Alex, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I thought we were trying to figure this out. I thought you were staying for Ethan. For us. I am staying for Ethan, he said, his voice softening but still laced with bitterness. But I don't know if there's an us to save. I needed someone to talk to, Claire. Someone who didn't make me feel like a fool every time I opened my mouth. The honesty in his words cut deeper than his anger. I knew I'd broken something between us, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it all the more real. Is it serious? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex hesitated, and in that moment, I saw the answer in his eyes. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just a way to forget everything for a little while. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I couldn't bring myself to respond, so I turned and walked away, retreating to the bedroom where I broke down in sobs. Over the next few days, the dynamic between Alex and me grew even more strained. He was polite but distant, and every time his phone buzzed, I wondered if it was Lauren. One evening, as Ethan was playing in the living room, Alex sat down next to me at the kitchen table. His face was serious, almost apologetic. We need to talk, he said. I braced myself for the worst. I'm going to stop seeing Lauren, he said, surprising me. Whatever this is, whatever's left between us. I owe it to Ethan to at least try. But I need you to know it's going to take time, Claire. A lot of time. I nodded, my heart aching with a mix of relief and uncertainty. I'll do whatever it takes, I said. I just want to make things right. But as Alex walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks in our marriage were still growing, no matter how hard I tried to patch them. Part 8. Ethan's questions. Alex kept his promise to stop seeing Lauren. At least, I believe he did. There were no more late-night texts, no guarded phone calls, or unexplained absences. But the tension between us remained, a fragile truce held together by our mutual love for Ethan. It wasn't long before Ethan began to pick up on the changes. He was a perceptive kid, and even though Alex and I avoided arguing in front of him, the undercurrent of unease in the house was impossible to miss. One night, as I was tucking him into bed, Ethan looked up at me with wide, questioning eyes. Mom, is everything okay with you and Dad? The innocence of the question made my chest tighten. Of course, sweetie, I said, forcing a smile. Why do you ask? He shrugged, his small hands fiddling with the edge of his blanket. You guys don't laugh together like you used to. And Dad doesn't call you honey anymore. I swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. Sometimes grown-ups go through hard things, I said carefully. But that doesn't mean we don't love you, okay? You're the most important person to us, Ethan. He seemed to accept that answer, at least for the moment, but his words stayed with me long after he fell asleep. The following weekend, Alex suggested a family outing to the park. It was the first time in weeks he'd proposed something like that, and I clung to the small glimmer of hope it gave me. Ethan was ecstatic, racing ahead of us with his soccer ball while Alex and I walked side by side, the distance between us still palpable but slightly less heavy. As we watched Ethan kick the ball around, Alex broke the silence. He doesn't deserve this, he said quietly. I know, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. I hate that my choices are hurting him. Alex sighed, his gaze fixed on Ethan. He's going to figure it out eventually. Kids aren't stupid, Claire. They know when something's off. I nodded, knowing he was right. Do you think we should tell him? About everything? Alex's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. Not yet, he said firmly. Not unless we have to. Let him be a kid for as long as he can. He doesn't need to carry this. For the first time in a long time, we were on the same page, united in our desire to protect Ethan. But fate, as always, had other plans. The turning point came a week later, during a routine parent-teacher conference. Ethan's teacher, Ms. Carter, pulled us aside after the meeting. Ethan's been asking a lot of questions about genetics, she said, her tone kind but concerned. Genetics? Alex repeated, frowning. Yes, Ms. Carter said. He brought it up during a science lesson about inherited traits. He was curious about why his hair is lighter than both of yours, and why his eyes are a different color. It seemed to be bothering him. My stomach dropped, and I exchanged a panicked glance with Alex. We'll talk to him, Alex said quickly, his voice steady. Thank you for letting us know. On the drive home, the silence between us was deafening. Ethan sat in the back seat, oblivious, humming a tune from one of his favorite cartoons. When we pulled into the driveway, Alex turned to me, his expression grim. This isn't going away, Claire. He's starting to notice. I nodded, my heart pounding. So what do we do? Alex's answer was simple, but terrifying. We tell him the truth. Part 9. The truth comes out. That evening, Alex and I sat Ethan down in the living room. My heart felt like it might beat out of my chest as I watched my son's face, still so full of innocence, oblivious to the weight of what was about to happen. Ethan, Alex began, his voice steady but soft. You've been asking some really good questions about where you get your hair color and your eyes. So, we thought it was time to have a talk about that. Ethan looked between us, curious but unconcerned. Okay, he said, swinging his legs back and forth on the couch. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice calm. You know how we've talked about how families can come together in all kinds of ways, right? Like how some kids have step-parents or are adopted? Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, well, I said, my voice cracking slightly. You have a really special story, too. Your dad has always been your dad, the one who's taken care of you and loved you since the day you were born. But you also have a biological father, someone else who helped make you. Ethan's brow furrowed. So, Dad's not my real dad. Alex leaned forward, his expression pained but gentle. I am your real dad, Ethan. Being a dad isn't just about biology. It's about loving you, teaching you, and being there for you. And I've been here for all of it, haven't I? Ethan nodded, but his face was clouded with confusion. But who's the other guy? I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. His name is Mark. He was someone I knew before you were born. But he's not a part of our lives, Ethan. He doesn't even know about you. What matters is that you're loved, by me and by Dad, more than anything in the world. Ethan sat quietly for a long moment, his small face processing something far too big for his years. Finally, he looked up at Alex. So you're still my dad? For real? Alex's voice broke as he pulled Ethan into a hug. Always, buddy. Nothing will ever change that. I watched the two of them, my heart aching with a mixture of love and guilt. Ethan's trust in Alex was unshaken, and for that, I was endlessly grateful. But as I tucked Ethan into bed that night, his innocent question shattered me. Do you think the other dad would want to meet me? I froze, unsure how to respond. I don't know, sweetie, I said finally. But you have everything you need right here with me and Dad. He nodded sleepily, and I kissed his forehead, my heart heavy with the knowledge that the storm wasn't over. Later, Alex and I sat in the dimly lit living room, the tension between us softer now but still present. I didn't expect him to ask about Mark, I said quietly. Alex leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Neither did I. What do we do if he asks again? Alex sighed. We cross that bridge when we come to it. But for now, I think we did the right thing, telling him. I nodded, though the uncertainty of the future loomed large. Do you think we can ever get past this? He turned to me, his eyes tired but less cold than before. I don't know, Claire. I really don't. But for Ethan's sake, I'm willing to try. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start, and for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of hope, fragile, tentative, but real. As we sat there in the quiet, I realized that rebuilding what we'd lost wouldn't be easy. But for Ethan, for Alex, for the life we'd built together, it was a chance I was determined to take.